When I was a much younger man, I used to work as a security guard at a chemical plant down in my home country of Mexico. And since I didn't kiss my boss's culo like some of the other guards did, I worked all-night shifts all the time. Now, I thought I'd hate it at first, but after a couple of weeks, I realized it wasn't just easy. It was kind of peaceful, too. Some of the other guards used to say it creeped them out to hang around a closed-down factory at night, but I didn't mind it. But not until I found those kids. Just over a year into the job, one of the bar gates on the plant's front entrance suffered a minor malfunction. It could have been a local teenager who broke it, or maybe they just figured it out, or overheard it someplace. But the bar didn't completely lock when it was down, meaning a person could just stop, get out, and lift up the bar before a second person drove the car right through into the plant. Now, the first time I saw a car parked around the back of the plant, I shined my flashlight at it, and it took off toward the front gate like a bat out of hell. I chased it around front, knowingly to have to stop to lift up the bar, but I wasn't fast enough, and they got away. I figured it was a bunch of drug addicts coming to steal whatever they could get their hands on. But then, a couple of nights later, when I saw another car, I caught quite a sight after creeping up on one. Now, two teenagers, a boy and a girl, trading kisses like it was their last night on Earth. All I wanted to do was tell them to move on, but they were so embarrassed they took off like a couple of frightened havilas. The closest town was a real conservative Catholic kind of place, and a lot of those kids' fathers were plant employees. This meant that they didn't want word of their actions spreading around the locker rooms, and usually all it took was a wave of my flashlight, and the cars would disappear like magic. But then came the time when my magic trick didn't work, and when I shined my flashlight on a trespassing car, it didn't move. I figured it was only a matter of time before I got some pushback from some of the kids. Word of a good makeout spot spread fast among high schoolers back then. Hell, it probably still does today. So, I figured the sooner or later I'd get a couple of kids who just wouldn't leave at the sight of my flashlight. Now, I walked towards the car, giving them a friendly warning about how they didn't have to go home, but they couldn't stay there. And the engine was off, and I figured the sound of my voice would have it starting up. But it didn't. I was walking up to the back of the car, and since I could see that there were people inside through the rear window, I called out again and asked them to leave. It feels dumb to say it now, but when they didn't respond that time either, I got kind of frustrated. And then, as I walked up on that passenger window, I yelled out, "Hey, I'm talking to you!" But the kids inside that old car couldn't hear a word I was saying, because both of them were dead. The boy in the driver's seat was only sitting upright because the wire he'd been strangled with was tied to the headrest. His tongue was out, and his face and hands looked bright blue in the beam of my flashlight. The girl next to him looked like she'd been stabbed in the side of the neck, and there was a ton of dried blood all over her left side and all over the center console, too. It was the worst thing I'd ever seen in my life. Not just because of how bloody it was, or how I hadn't expected to find the two bodies, but because their eyes were wide open when I found them. The girls were half closed. She looked sleepy, but the boys were almost bulging out of their sockets, and that final look of death terror was preserved for me to see. I ran to the plant security office and called the cops. And then a short while later, a single officer drove over from the town precinct to check out what I'd reported. By the time my shift ended, the back of the plant surrounding the car was a crime scene with a bunch of cops all walking around, while a police photographer took pictures of the bodies. The guy replacing me was asking if I was all right, because he must have seen how shaken up I was. I told him I was fine. I just needed a day off to drink and forget. But as much as I tried, I couldn't shake the image of those two kids sitting in that car. After that, every time I did a foot patrol around the plant, I'd find myself lingering near the spot I used to find the cars. And it took me a while to face up to it, but I was truly haunted by what I saw that night. I found a security job someplace else in the months that followed. Then about a year later, I moved to Arizona with my heavily pregnant wife. Tucson is crazy in its own way, but it's my home now. And while all kinds of terrible stuff happens on this side of the border, too, I actually have faith that the police want to do something about the crimes that happen here. And I can't say that for my country of birth. It seems odd to think that seeing something so terrible was the start of my journey to the U.S. But it also reminds me of something my abuelita used to say when I was growing up. She used to say, "There is no evil from which good does not come." My name's KD. I'm almost 30, and I'm a huge fan. I went through a really stressful and scary time last year, and your videos helped me so much. So, I thought a good way of thanking you would be to write an account of what happened to me so you can share it with your viewers. So, in April of last year, I was lying in bed and scrolling through Instagram when a message request suddenly appeared in my DMs. I get scammers sending me sketchy links from time to time, and I usually just block them. But this time, the profile looked legit, and the message just sort of said, "Hi?" I decided to scope out the profile a little bit, and when I did, I saw it belonged to a girl who lived in the same city as me. Then, since we were roughly the same age, I figured that there might be a connection there. I replied saying, "Sorry, do we know each other?" With a little smiley face, too, so she knew that I wasn't being rude. It came through 2 minutes later, but when I opened it, I saw it wasn't a text message, but a voice note that was like a minute long. I had no reason not to press play. I'd heard scammers calling sweet old ladies pretending to be the IRS and nothing about them sending voice notes. So I pressed play, and my God, do I wish I hadn't. The first words were, "Hello, Katie." And as soon as I heard them, I felt this full-body sinking feeling, like I wanted to bury myself into the mattress and hide. The voice, obviously, wasn't human. It was some kind of really basic-sounding AI thing that sounded almost like a robot. Maybe hearing it in some other context wouldn't be all that scary, but hearing it in bed all alone, except for my 7-year-old daughter in the room next door, it just about scared the hell out of me. It started out with, "Hello, Katie. I've been watching you for quite some time, and I've decided you have to die. But not just you. Your daughter needs to die, too." They went on and on about how someone was going to make me watch as they killed her, and then a whole bunch of other stuff that made me sick to my stomach. But the thing that really scared me, the thing that had me rushing to the window and scanning the street outside, was when he started describing the house we lived in. It wasn't just the house either. Whoever made that recording knew what my daughter looked like. He knew her name, and he knew what elementary school she went to. The message ended with a few more threats about how he was going to die, and then signed off with "Enjoy your final days, because I'm going to enjoy ending them." When the message ended, I just laid there for a minute, wondering what the hell I should do. I knew I needed to call the cops, but I also knew all they'd do was take my report and be on their way. I needed someone to come over and stay with me, someone who could make me feel safe. So, I called Joey. Joey and I had been dating on and off for about a year, and while we'd officially broken up a few months back, we somehow fell back into the same old dating pattern. Joey was close with my daughter. My dad liked him, and he was pretty handy with repairs and maintenance stuff, too. So, it was nice to have him around. The only issue was his drinking habits, because when he drank, he became a totally different person. Someone I didn't want around my daughter, and he refused to straight up quit it. He cut down a bunch, which was the reason that I still took his calls or hung out with him. And then, when I got that voice message that night, he was the first person I thought to call. He drove over as quickly as he could, so maybe 20 minutes after calling him, he was sitting in my TV room being my shoulder to cry on. I didn't want to hear the voice message again, so he took my phone into another room to listen to it. And when he came back, he looked this sort of mix of really scared and really mad. He told me we needed to call the cops, and while obviously I already knew that, he gave me a ton of hope by telling me about all the new techniques they had to catch cyberstalkers. 10 years before, they'd have told me to just block the person and move on, but now they had whole departments dedicated to tracing and arresting those responsible. He said he'd watched a documentary on it a while back, and that if I went to the cops, we could stop it before things got out of control. I told him he could sleep on the couch if he wanted to, but he didn't. He spent the rest of the night watching the street outside and reading about the experiences of others who dealt with cyberstalking to give us ideas on how to fight it. He had to work in the morning, too, and while I called in sick, Joey powered through before coming back to check on us once he clocked out. I called the cops that morning, and then a few days later, they sent over a detective who worked exclusively with victims of cyberstalking. She laid out the playbook of what I was to do, and fortunately, it didn't include any of the delete, block, and move on stuff that I was actually worried about. It was actually the total opposite, because the detective talked all about how I needed to keep records of each message. I had to save every voice note, every piece of text I was sent, and all the usernames from the various accounts my stalker was using to harass me. And boy, did they harass me. The fresh Instagram accounts came thick and fast, each sending what looked like innocent messages, so the app didn't filter them out. But I knew as soon as I accepted the message request, a voice note would arrive, and that same process repeated itself every time I did. I didn't listen to any of them. I just kept them in my inbox, so the cops would be able to. But my stalker must have also figured out I wasn't listening to them because they quickly switched up their methods. Late one night, right as I was finishing up my skincare routine, I realized I had a missed call from an unknown number. It wasn't a no-caller ID number, just one I didn't recognize. And since they called so late, I figured it was important enough for me to listen to the voicemail they left. The detective I'd spoken to had called me out of hours once or twice, so I figured that it might have been someone from the department trying to catch me before bedtime. But it wasn't. It was another one of those robotic voice notes. I only listened for a few seconds before I hung up, but that was all I needed. I broke down crying, then called Joey to see if he'd come over again. And just like that first time, he drove over as quickly as he could to be my shoulder to cry on. He was so amazing that night. I cried so loud that it woke my daughter up, so she was crying too by the time he arrived. The first thing that he did was calm her down and get her back to bed, telling her how everything was going to be just fine. The next morning, Joey drove my daughter to school while I called the cyber-stalking detective. I gave her the phone number the voicemail came from, saying maybe she could trace it or whatever. She thanked me before saying that sometimes cyberstalkers just get bored and move on to someone else. But my stalker didn't get bored. Instead, they escalated. I actually thought things were getting better at first because the number of Instagram messages slowed down a little and didn't get any more voicemails either. But then, one night, right around the same time of night as both voice messages had arrived, I heard a super loud banging on my door. It wasn't just someone trying to be heard either. Someone was trying to scare me. I was upstairs when it happened, towing off after taking a shower, and my daughter was staying with my mom, who volunteered to take care of her while things blew over. I was so glad that she was there that night too, because that banging scared the hell out of me. I slammed my bedroom door closed and sat against it after grabbing my phone. That time, I didn't call Joey first. I called the cops instead. I told the dispatcher I had a stalker, and that I thought he'd escalated and come to my house for the first time. The dispatcher asked if I feared for my life. Then, when I said I did, she sent 2 patrol cars over to take a look around. The whole time, whoever was outside kept hammering on my door, while the dispatcher kept me on the line with her. And then suddenly, the banging just stopped. The next thing I heard was the police sirens. Just a short burst to let you know that they were there. The dispatcher asked if I heard it, and then when I said yes, she told me to stay put, while the 2 officers searched the outside of my property. A few minutes later, the dispatcher told me she was ending the call and that I was to head downstairs and open the door for those 2 cops. And I thanked her and then did as she asked. The next day was a Saturday, but I managed to talk to the cyber-stalking detective a little on the phone, and she told me it was best that I stayed someplace else for a while, which was how I ended up sleeping in my mom's spare bedroom with my daughter. And that little reunion was a silver lining. But it didn't last long because, when I next returned home to grab some more clothes, I discovered someone had broken in. It didn't look like they'd stolen anything, and they hadn't smashed anything either. But when I walked into the kitchen, I saw someone had pinned a note to the fridge. It was a printout, not handwritten, and all it said was, "I see you," with a text message smiley face emoji. And that was probably the worst part of that whole period for me, knowing that I couldn't go home. And I leaned a lot on my mom for support. But Joey was a huge help, too. He offered to let me and my daughter stay at his place, but I figured it was more comforting for her to be around her grandmother. It also meant that we had a place that we could be alone. Joey and me, I mean, which was something we both appreciated. And that's how I lived for almost 2 and 12 weeks, until the cyber-stalking detective suddenly called one day and asked if she could pay me a visit. We arranged to meet at my mom's place, and when she arrived, she told me she had good news and bad news. But the good news was that the police had found my stalker. I could have just about jumped for joy in that moment. And I remember sitting there with this big smile on my face after she told me, but the detective didn't seem to share my happiness. She told me my stalker had been smart and had used a whole bunch of computer wizardry to make sure almost everything they did was totally untraceable. They just made one fatal mistake, because when they downloaded those pictures of the girl I thought that I might have known, the one from the first voice message, he didn't scrub the metadata from them. This meant the cops could trace where the device images were uploaded from, and bingo, that's how they got them. The detective then explained that they were planning on arresting my stalker that same day. But before they did, they wanted me to hear the news from them rather than through the grapevine. I just wanted her to tell me who it was so bad. So bad that I didn't stop to think why learning their identity might be bad news for me. But then she just came out and said it. There's no easy way to say this, Katie. And I'm so sorry to be the one who has to tell you. But the person stalking you is your friend Joey. My mind just went totally blank for a second. And then, once I could finally form a coherent thought, I decided that she must have been confused somehow. I reminded her that Joey was my ex-boyfriend, someone I was super close with, and how we were actually on the verge of getting back together since he'd been so helpful and supportive. I told her that she had to be mistaken, and I clearly remember the look of pity that she gave me after I did. She rehashed a little of what she'd said about how they'd figured out it was him. They said if it wasn't Joey that had created the first Insta profile on his computer, then they needed to figure out who did. And that gave me this little ray of hope that it was all just a big mistake, and it wasn't someone I loved that had been terrorizing me. But once the cops visited Joey's place and told him he was looking at jail time, he confessed everything after they hauled him off to the station. It only felt real after the detective came over another time, and showed me the video of Joey confessing in the interview room. But there was one part that she said that would be of particular interest to me. And that was the part where Joey explained why he did it. He sounded like he'd been crying as he told the cop interviewing him that he did it in his words, so she'd need me. The cop sounded like he sympathized with him, but the detective swore it was just an act to get Joey to talk more. She also said that since Joey had no priors and he cooperated and confessed to everything, he most likely wasn't going to prison. He'd probably be able to make bail somehow, too. But the judge at his hearing would issue an emergency restraining order, preventing him from coming anywhere near me. And if he did, he'd go straight to jail to await trial there. And that was the first good news I'd heard in a really long time. Actual good news, I mean. Obviously, I wanted Joey out of my life. I wanted to forget I even met him. And it made me sick to think that we'd slept together while he was secretly making my life a living hell. Thankfully, once all our friends heard about what he did, Joey ended up leaving town and moving someplace across the country. It felt good knowing the whole thing had ruined his life, just like it had ruined mine for a while. And wherever the hell he went, I hope he rots there. My name is Bradley, and in 2008 I was working for a big insurance firm here in Birmingham. We sold insurance to big construction firms, and I was paid very well for what was basically just a junior role. I was living the dream. I was young, single, with a lot of disposable income, even for London. But then came the Big Short, as you know, and everything went down the toilet. I lost my job just days after the market pooed the bed. I had a bit of dough saved up, so I wasn't as hard up as some other people. But as the months went by and the job market didn't improve, that little nest egg of mine kept getting smaller and smaller. Once I was eligible, I applied for job seekers allowance, meaning that I got money from the government if I could prove that I was looking for work. But that only went so far, and my savings kept on shrinking as I held out for another finance job. Then finally, once the situation started looking critical, I did something very silly. I got in touch with an old mate of mine named Darren and asked him for a big favor. Darren and I had been mates all through school, but had drifted apart once we got to university, because Darren got mad into ganja. He wasn't a waste man with it. He had a proper job and all that, but after work, he'd just zone out and smoke loads of ganja playing GTA 4, and I'd never even touched the stuff. I hated the idea of what smoking would do to my lungs. So, imagine Darren's surprise when I called him up one day and asked if he could get me some weed. So I went over, and then, once we'd caught up a little bit, I basically started grilling him on how much weed he smoked a week, and how much it cost, and where he got it from. And he asked if I wanted to try out smoking for the first time, but I said no, and that I wanted to try out selling it instead. I'll never forget his face. He literally couldn't believe his ears. But after I told him about my money trouble, and how it was only supposed to be a temporary thing while I was out of work, it started to make a bit more sense to him. We talked until late about almost every aspect of the trade. Darren had never sold weed himself, but he knew a fair bit about it. And then, after a call to his dealer to get his approval, Darren gave me his number and we set up a meeting. I started selling a few ounces a week to Darren and friends of his that I knew personally, but only that select group of people to keep things small, safe, and profitable. But after a while, they convinced me to allow people I didn't know to call over. Now, I was dead against it at first, but when I did the maths and realized that I'd earned hundreds more a week with just a few more customers, I changed my mind fast. By the time my customer base hit double figures, I was able to cover the price of everything job seekers allowance wouldn't. which was a massive weight off my shoulders. I kept up with my job-seeking commitments, though. I genuinely wanted to get back into work, but I didn't think anything would come along for quite a while. And then one day, just as markets started to recover, I landed a job. The pay wasn't as generous as my first job before the crash, and I was looking at a long probation period, but getting back into the office was preferable to having to visit the job center every 2 weeks, which was so depressing. It used to sap the life out of me. I took the position and carried on selling weed to Darren and Company until my first pay slip arrived. Then, when it did, I tried deleting the dealer's number. I just couldn't do it. I was making hundreds of pounds a week for doing next to nothing, and I was doing it in a way that I thought was safe and secure. So, when it came to giving it up, all I could think was, why should I? I sometimes wonder if I'd stop right then and there, I'd have avoided what was coming. But a part of me thinks that it wouldn't have mattered, and it was already too late. Now, cut to about 3 or 4 months after I got back into work, and I'm still selling ganja to that small group of customers. It was a Wednesday night, and I'd been asleep for about 3 hours when a sudden noise from downstairs had me jumping out of bed. My alarm clock said 203, a number I'll never forget, as the same sound repeated itself from downstairs. It was a sharp bang, bang, bang of a fist slamming into my door. And then, when I went up to the top of the stairs, I heard the one thing that I'd prayed that I'd never hear. Police, open up the door. I'd feared that moment so much over the past few months, but I'd also done a lot to prepare for it. Having put so much thought into my various hiding places, I was very confident the police could search my entire house and not find a single banknote or a single baggie. So, I made one of the worst mistakes of my entire life, and I walked downstairs to open the door. Before I reached it, the man on the other side of the door gave me another loud bang and announced himself as police again. I told him, "All right, I'm coming," and then started prepping myself to act all innocent. I undid both locks, nice and slow, too, so I had time to calm myself down a bit more. But then, when I opened the door, I just about filled my boxers with fear because it wasn't the police. It was a load of men in mass, holding tools as weapons. I looked at them for what felt like seconds, but was probably only a fraction of one, and then tried slamming the door in their faces, but it was too slow. The man who'd been banging stuck his boot out, stopping me from being able to close it. And then another one of them rushed forward to either kick the door or slam his shoulder into it, because the next thing I know, the frame is flying out of my grip and they're shoving their way inside. I tried running to my kitchen because the back door was there, but since I kept that one locked too, I was still trying to turn the key when one of the guys rushed in and grabbed me. I tried shoving him off and fighting him, but he had a hammer, and one blow from that was all it took to get me to give up. I had my back up against the kitchen's back door, hands raised to try and fend off another hammer blow, while shouting about how they can take whatever they want if they didn't hurt me anymore. I thought it was just a very aggressive burglary, and that after taking my TV and laptop, they'd be on their way. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. They all had balaclavas on, and mostly wore black or other dark colors. So, the only way that I could tell them apart was by what they were wearing or carrying. And that's how, when the one with the hammer backed off a bit, I recognized the fellow who'd been banging on my door as he stepped in. He pointed a wrench at me and then told me in no uncertain terms that if I didn't cooperate, they were going to kill me. I just nodded like, "Yeah, okay." And then he grabbed me by the hair and dragged me into the front room. And once I was there, I saw one of the men pull out a length of blue plastic cord from the front pocket of his hoodie. I started to panic again, because it was obvious they were planning to tie me up. But all it took was another couple of threats, before I decided the rope was preferable to the hammer. I thought they wanted me tied up so I couldn't cause problems for them. I also wouldn't be able to phone the police until long after they'd left. But again, I was wrong. They had other plans for me. They tied my wrist behind my back, then tied my ankles and knees together before pushing me onto the couch. I told them all a second time to take whatever they wanted, and I thought that they'd go about carrying off the TV and all that to what I assumed was a van waiting outside, but instead, they started asking me where my stash spots were. For the second time that night, I got that horrible sick feeling. And it came when I realized that my big secret, the one I'd worked so hard to protect, wasn't a secret anymore. I tried playing ignorant at first, saying that I didn't know what they were talking about. But that didn't wash. One of the blows started bashing my legs with something heavy, and when I screamed, another one clamped his hand over my mouth. They kept on hitting me over and over while I screamed into that guy's hand. But when they asked me again where my stash was, I somehow found the will to play ignorant again. I suppose that was the thought of losing all that money I had hidden away, which by that point was a couple of thousand that kept my mouth shut. And I was amazed that I had the minerals in me to withstand a round of torture. But when they upped the ante and threatened to start cutting off my toes with a pair of pliers, I broke. I screamed at them to stop as soon as I felt cold metal on one of my toes, and then told them exactly where they needed to look to find both my money and the ounce bags of weed that I had hidden away upstairs. Two of the guys kept watching over me, while the other ran upstairs to grab everything. I heard them rummaging around for a bit, and then suddenly I heard one of them shout, "Found it!" A few seconds later, they came back downstairs holding the bags I kept my cash and ganja in. And then, once the lead bloke was happy with everything there, he ordered his boys out of the house. But not before telling one of them to put me to sleep. I thought that was it, that they were going to kill me to make sure that there was no witnesses. I was almost relieved when I saw the bloke who approached me draw back his fist in preparation to punch me. And then, when he did, it landed right on my jaw. And at that moment, everything started to go fuzzy. When I next opened my eyes, the masked men were gone, and the house was quiet again. I remember being robbed, but somehow tied up had slipped my mind. So, it was only when I tried to move again that I realized I couldn't. I started to panic again, because I realized that even though I'd be missed at work in the next couple of hours, my bosses wouldn't jump straight to calling the police. They just assumed that I'd pulled a sick or something. And if I didn't get myself some help now, I could be stuck in the house for God knows how long, waiting for someone to knock at the door or realize I was missing. The thoughts scared the crap out of me. And even though it hurt like a bastard to fight against the ropes, I did everything I could to loosen them. It was no good, though, and by the time I kept it cutting into my wrists, I knew that I'd have to try something else. I ended up hopping over to my home phone, which sat on the coffee table in the back room. I sat myself down on the floor, kicked it off the table so the handset got a dial tone, and then I called the only person whose phone number I knew off by heart, the dealer I used to buy from. I had to try a few times, because he didn't answer the first few times I called. But then finally, after feeling my hope shrink down to almost nothing, he answered the phone with a very groggy, "Yo," and I told him it was an emergency, that he needed to come over to my place right away. He replied that he had his kid with him, so he couldn't make it, and I reckoned that he thought that it was after a few fresh ounces. But when I told him what had happened, he said he'd come over as soon as possible. I told him where I'd hidden a spare back door key in the garden. And then, after he hung up, I just laid there, praying that he'd show up. About half an hour later, I heard someone climbing over the back fence. And that's when I got up and hopped towards the sliding doors in the back room. And I felt this deep feeling of relief when I saw who walked into the garden. It was the dealer, true to his word. And after he unlocked that back door, he helped cut away the ropes and free me. I couldn't stay long. He really did have his kid with him, and she was asleep in the back seat of his car. But after I explained what had happened, he actually told me I was lucky. He knew about one fell who'd come away with a nasty scar on his chest, with the gang had taken a hot clothing iron to him, and another who never walked properly again after a gang smashed one of his knees to pieces. I remember asking him, "What do I do now? I can't phone the police, can I?" And all he said back was, "Move into the other side of the city if possible, because once they found you, they always come back." And I took his advice, and I moved house as soon as possible. It wrecked me financially, because obviously I was still under a contract I had to fight to be free of, but wild horses couldn't have stopped me moving, because there was no way that I was going to risk going through that again. I finally stopped selling, too. I'd always known that I wasn't cut out for that life, and that's why I promised myself it'd be a temporary thing. But seeing and experiencing the brutal realities up close was another thing entirely. There are some bad men in the world, but it's nice to know I'm not one of them. Just over 20 years ago now, when our daughter was still in diapers, my wife and I moved out of our one-bedroom apartment and into what we called our starter home. It was a 2-bedroom townhouse right on the boundary between the city and the suburbs, and we were in love with it from the moment we attended viewing. We lived there for almost 10 years, and it was a great place to live. And I've got a lot of very happy memories of our daughter's childhood in that house. But it's also the place where I experienced one of the most frightening and disturbing things of my entire life. The street that we lived on was kind of out of the way, and that meant peace, quiet, and a very low crime rate. It was serene compared to the neighborhood of our old apartment, and that was a place where you basically had to be on your toes all the time. So, after a few months of living there, I slowly started to let my guard down. I still kept all the doors locked at night, and I still kept my gun ready to go in its lockbox, but I stopped having to be so suspicious of crazy neighbors and local weirdos, and it was great. But then, imagine the terror that I felt when I woke up in the middle of the night in our peaceful new neighborhood and heard noises coming from downstairs. My wife was asleep next to me, and our daughter was in her crib just a few feet away from our bed. So, I knew whoever was downstairs must have broken in somehow. I woke up. I'm sorry, guys. This has been such a tough night. I woke up my wife, told her what was going on, and then told her to call the cops, while I made sure the home invader didn't make it upstairs. Then I made for my closet, grabbed my gun from the lockbox, and then crept out into the upstairs hallway as quietly as possible. Looking back on it, I can remember the exact point I changed my mind on what I was going to do. I knew that I didn't want to kill anybody, because no matter the circumstances, I didn't want that on my conscience. But I also wanted this mother effort to pay for breaking into my family's home and putting my girls in danger. So that's when I made up my mind to try and surprise them, and then keep them where they were under pain of death, till the cops showed up and arrested them. Once I was maybe 23 of the way down the stairs, still creeping quieter than a mouse, I heard noises coming from our kitchen. I figured they'd be in the living room where all the most valuable stuff was, but when I heard sounds from the kitchen, I realized that I'd have to creep all the way down the first-floor corridor without alerting whoever was there. My heart was thumping like a drum as I walked barefoot along the wooden floor, and I seriously struggled to maintain my cool as I heard them moving around. I froze when I heard the faint sound of a chair leg scraping against the linoleum floor, then listening as I heard the sound of someone opening and closing cabinets. I guess that should have been a clue right there that someone was digging through our kitchen cabinets and not our living room with its brand new DVD player. But at the time, I was too hopped up on adrenaline to think about anything other than my plan. And things didn't drop until I peeked around the kitchen doorway. I had my gun ready and was about to tear around that area like I was in a movie shouting freeze. But when I peeked around the corner and into the barely lit kitchen, there was just enough light coming through the windows for me to see that it wasn't some 6-foot jailbird armed to the teeth. It was a little kid. He was wearing what looked like shorts, but nothing on top, and he was standing on a chair while digging through our snack cabinet. I watched him stuffing the pocket of his shorts with candy and chocolate bars, and as I did, all the anger just went out of me and was replaced by a kind of sadness. I didn't want to frighten him, not just because he was a kid who was, from his height, looked to be no older than 6 or 7, but because I was scared that he might fall off the chair and hit his head on the corner of the kitchen table. I thought about whispering something softly just to gently get his attention, but I decided that that would probably come off as creepy, and maybe scare him even worse than just yelling something at him. But then it occurred to me to just switch on the kitchen light. The second I did, the kid's head spun around to look at me, and he just froze, looking at me. All I said was, "It's okay. It's okay, buddy." And then I asked him super softly if he was hungry. The kid didn't answer, but even if he had, I'm not sure that I'd have heard him. I tried to stay very smiley and friendly-looking too, so as not to alarm him. But once I got a good look at the kid, that smile was wiped from my face. Like I said, the kid was bare-chested and wearing shorts, but he was barefoot too, and his hair was really short, like someone had given him a buzz cut in the last couple of weeks. But what really caught my attention were all the scars he had all over his chest and arms. They were small enough to be cigarette burns, but they also weren't circular either, so Lord knows what caused them. There were a lot of them, too, maybe 24 spread all over. But that's not all this kid had on his body, because on his face, neck, and right arm were these small black symbols. And that poor kid had been tattooed. I asked the kid what his name was, trying to get him talking and calm him down, but he didn't talk, not once. He just got down off the chair very slow, with his pockets stuffed with candy, and then stood very still and stared at me. I asked him if he'd run away from home. He stayed quiet, but his eyes darted over to our pantry in the back door beyond. I couldn't see inside the pantry from where I was standing in the kitchen doorway. So, when his eyes went there, the first thing I thought was, "Holy crap, he's not alone." I jumped back from the kitchen doorway and raised my gun towards the pantry, half expecting the monster who scarred up that kid to come bouncing around the corner with a weapon of his own, raised. But the only thing I saw was the kid go tearing past my field of view and ran into the pantry. I waited a second before moving to peek inside, and then when I did, the last I saw of the kid was his feet just sort of wriggling through the doggy door. The doggy door had been installed before we moved in, and since we planned to get a dog in the near future, we actually kept it. It was so bizarre to me that if I'd have woken up right then and the whole thing had been nothing but a dream, I would not have been surprised at all. But it was real. So, after taking a few seconds to process everything, I called the cops to tell them what happened. Now, just to be clear, I didn't call 911 to report a break-in or trespassing or anything like that. I called because I saw a kid who had been subjected to some horrific physical abuse. He needed to be found, and he needed to be rescued. Once I told her it was safe and that the cops were stopping by, my wife came downstairs to make some coffee. And these two uniformed cops stopped by about an hour later, and I told them everything I could about the kid's appearance and how he'd acted. Now, one of them asked if I noticed anything strange about any of my neighbors or noticed any behavior that suggested that they might be hiding something. And the answer to that was definitely no. I hadn't met anyone who set off any alarm bells. But the cop then suggested that if the kid was climbing through these doggy doors to steal candy, he could have been starving after being on the run for days. But on the run from who? You know, what kind of person treats a child like that? I wished the cops a ton of luck before I left, because good God did I want them to find that kid. And more than 20 years later, there's not a day that goes by that I'm not reminded of him in some way. Back when I was still a college student and living in dorms, I woke up in the middle of the night one time to hear an argument unfolding outside my window. It wasn't super loud or anything, but it was literally right there outside my window. And since it was a warm night, and I kept my window open, it woke me up. Now, my first thought was to tell whoever it was to shut the hell up, because it was like 3:00 a.m., and I had classes the next morning. But after I overheard what they were fighting about, the gossip in me suddenly wanted to listen. It was a boy and girl arguing, mostly in very hushed tones, but every so often the tension would rise, and so would their voices before one shushed the other back to just whispering. And at first, I thought they were a couple. And then I realized that they were an ex-couple, and that the boy was basically pleading with the girl for them to get back together. He kept apologizing for something he hadn't told her, but she didn't want to hear it. She called him disgusting, said he should be ashamed of himself, and that he never wanted to talk to him ever again. She said that, but there she was, still talking to him, and doing it outside my dorm at 3:00 a.m. to 2. That had me thinking that they were both as bad as one another. One of those toxic couples that shouldn't be together, but can't seem to separate. But since the tea was being spilled, I guess I was going to drink it. After pulling back the curtains just a little, I peeked out from around them, trying to figure out who each party was. I thought I recognized the girl's voice from somewhere, so she had to be living in one of the nearby dorms. But I didn't recognize the boy's voice at all, so I tried getting a look at both of them to see who they were. It was dark outside, and the couple were standing right at the edge of the parking lot. They weren't all the way lit up by the streetlights, and the boy, half of the couple, had his back to me. So, without being able to ID them, I just kind of kept on watching from my window and listening into what they were talking about. But all they did was go round and round in circles. Now, the boy was trying to explain something in a very low voice. And then, in a slightly louder one, the girl would then respond, "I hate you. You disgust me. If I've ever known who you really were, I'd have never have dated you." And it seemed like the guy had something that he didn't want people to know, which was why he was always the quieter one. But the girl knew it, and was absolutely letting him have it. Then, as she went off on some rant about how gross he was, he wheeled around in frustration like he was about to walk off. But he didn't walk off. Instead, he turned back and punched the girl in the face, as hard as he could. And the impact was loud, and the noise that the girl made when he hit her was so upsetting that I just gasped and held a hand over my mouth as she fell to the ground. The boy leaned over her and looked like he was about to hit her some more. So I kind of got up on my tiptoes so I could yell at the window. And I remember saying, "Hey, leave her alone, you piece of crap." I guess he didn't realize how he was being watched that whole time. Because the second he did, the boy started running off towards his car and then took off driving like some crazy person. Now, my yelling woke up some of the fellow students, and they were pissed to be woken up when they had classes in the morning. But all it took was me telling them what happened, and they came running too. I figured the boy had knocked the girl clean out with that punch. But when he ran outside, we found her having some kind of seizure. And that was one of the scariest things I'd seen in my whole life, because I was convinced that she'd hit her head on the concrete and was going to die as a result. Thankfully, the girl survived with just a concussion, and her ex-boyfriend ended up getting arrested. But the whole thing that made a lasting impression on me, and even all these years later, was still thinking about that girl and how sickening the noise was that she made after she got punched. Story 6. To preface this story, I need to explain something about the room I work and sleep in. It's a ground-floor room at the front of a terrace townhouse. There's a small garden just outside my window, which is a huge set of 3 bay windows. The left and right windows open from the bottom. This means when it's unpleasantly hot, which is a lot of the time in the UK lately, there's basically an opening in my room at a height that someone could simply step over and into the room. This isn't normally a problem because I work nights, so I'd only be asleep in the room in the middle of the day. Any other time, who would climb into an occupied room? And even if they were going to, I'd hear and see them open the garden gate and then walk up the garden path to my window. Someone breaking in through the window while I'm in the room just didn't seem like a likely or plausible scenario. That is until a series of events played out that led to exactly this happening. One other thing I need to explain first is I don't have curtains hung on these windows. The garden blocks the view from the street, and when the windows were replaced, I just never paid to get new curtains put up because I literally never use them. I hate having the air into the room blocked, and I hate blocking out the natural light. When I sleep in the daytime, I use a sleep mask, so I just didn't need curtains. Then one day, the council replaced the street light right outside my window. What used to be a warm orange glow was replaced by a harsh spotlight white that completely illuminates my entire front garden and shines essentially a floodlight in through my window. They're supposed to fit these street lights out with rear guards to prevent light pollution of personal property, but they just haven't. We've complained all the street lights in my cul-de-sac are like this, but they never did anything. So, what I did was I bought a canvas printed fold-out screen, and it seemed like a perfect option. I can open and close it, move it at will, and shield whichever parts of the room I want. And it's a hell of a lot cheaper and less committal than hanging curtains. This worked great for a couple of years, until one day, very recently, there was a pop outside my window. I was sitting on the chair against the other wall of the room facing the screen when the pop happened. It took me a moment to realize that the street light outside had blown. Hey, fine by me. That annoying Posos had been dazzling me with its overly bright bulb shining in my room for years now, and I wasn't going to shed a tear for it just 'cause it blew up. When my entire power shut off an hour later, though, then I wasn't happy. I sat there in pitch-perfect darkness for a bit. Eventually, I could hear the sound of drilling and clanking from a few blocks away, and soon realized that they were obviously doing some kind of electrical work. The last time this happened in my street unprompted, the power had been out for 2 hours. This was in the early evening. This was in the middle of the night, just past midnight, and I didn't have a torch nearby or anything. I just had my cell phone with 48 battery. I tried to read a Superman comic by the light of my phone for a bit, but it was a strain on the eyes. You see, I'm disabled and not too steady on my feet, so I don't really want to go walking around the pitch-dark house in the middle of the night either. So, eventually, I shut my phone off, put the Superman book on the side table, and just sort of relaxed in the chair. I have no idea how long I'd been asleep when I woke back up. The power was still off, and for a second, I forgot why it was so perfectly pitch dark. When you're used to constant light pollution to some degree, having the power for your entire street go off is really eerie, especially when you can't see 2 feet in front of you, which means you can't see what's making that scraping and dragging sound. I listened hard. I could vaguely see movement in front of me. Was the screen falling over? No. Crap. No. It was being folded back. In the pitch dark, in the middle of the night, someone had climbed in through my window while I was asleep, and they were now on the small space in between the screen and the window itself. I strained really hard to make out whatever I could. I thought I could see a hand wrapped around the edge of the screen, but it was almost impossible to tell. Even as the screen folded back and exposed the room to the meager light of the crescent moon, I barely had any more light, but it was enough to see that, yes, someone had in fact climbed through the window and were carefully moving the screen aside. The moon had slightly lit them up, but I was still in total darkness on the chair. My heart was absolutely hammering in my chest, and I had no idea what kind of thief this was. They could have a weapon. It could be a knife. They seemed thin and of average height, and they took a shaky step or two into the room, and I could tell that they were looking about as if trying to make out a route. My room is pretty cluttered, being charitable, so almost immediately they reached out and brushed a table. Then I heard the scraping of their foot nudging a box. There was no way that I was going to sit there in the dark and wait until they noticed and stabbed me. My room is pretty cluttered, being charitable, so almost immediately they reached out and brushed a table. Then I heard the scraping of their foot nudging a box. There was no way I was going to sit there in the dark and wait until they noticed and stabbed me. I had one single option, and I hoped to God that if I took it, things would play out. Putting on my most terrifying horror creator voice, sitting completely in the dark on my chair, I growled, "Get out, before you can't live to regret it." Here it was. Either I'd succeeded or I was about to get brained or stabbed or worse. The figure jerked and clattered against something and absolutely honed it out of the open window. Christ, poor guy. I think I scared him even more than he'd scared me. And immediately I ran to the window, knocking on my phone flashlight and shining it down on the street. He looked like some kind of older teenager, maybe as he legged it down the street and around the corner. I didn't bother calling the cops or anything. Maybe I should have. But I know that they wouldn't have done anything because all he did really was briefly enter my property and then leave. At that moment, as I saw someone peering around my screen in the damn darkness, though I've never been more afraid in my life, and hot damn, I'm definitely going to be a lot more careful with leaving the window open going forward. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't invest in a gym.